Today on The State of Us, a centrist party in theory, Lincoln's version of democracy. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson. Today, we're taking a look at whether or not America wants a centrist party. Well, the answer is yes, in theory. And we're going to talk about what does that mean. There was a new poll that came out that gave us some insight into what a large group of Americans claim that they want. Not saying that they don't, but obviously it in theory versus in practice might be different. Then we're also going to transition into talking about Lincoln's vision of democracy based on three components that he outlined in the Gettysburg Address. And we're going to discuss how that relates to the idea of a centrist party in theory, and then what about in practice? So we've got a few things to cover today, Lance.
Quite a number of them, but I think it's good to note that historically this is not uncharted waters. Okay, there's nothing in our history that says, oh, we always have Democrats and Republicans. That is not the case. And third parties have played a major role, but this is, looking at maybe does this centrist party, and what I like to talk about is, does this centrist party replace the Democrats or Republicans? Are we as Americans, are there enough of us that are fed up with the inactive, complaining political parties towards each other and getting nothing done, ready to push them aside and say, we want a party who's going to work for the people, not someone who is just going to complain about what the other side's trying to do to us. So and again, I think it's possible that this could happen. Yes, it is a theory, but it is a theory that has been out there in American history throughout our 200 years. We didn't start with Democrats and Republicans, and we have had political challenges. That's how the current Republican Party began. It was a challenge to the two-party system back in the 1850s. So again, doesn't mean we have, we're not stuck here. Don't anybody get that idea that we have to have two political parties, number one, and number two, they have to be Democrats and Republicans.
Right. Well, a lot of people, I'm not sure if everybody, has some idea of the importance of President Lincoln, but when you actually look at history and read about him, obviously you come to understand that he didn't even start as a Republican because the Republicans weren't a party that, had any power or say, until much later. He was a Whig initially, and that party even wasn't that old. Formed in the 1830s, in opposition to Andrew Jackson. So the point being, right, that there's a lot of ebb and flow. The party system that we know today hasn't always existed the way that it does right now. And we've seen different parties rise and fall throughout our history. So the notion of a centrist party or another party coming into existence is certainly not something that's new to the United States, although new in terms of to those of us alive today, probably not something that we're familiar with. But in looking at do Americans want another party, there was a poll recently conducted where they asked respondents to choose among four options: candidates from a new party to the left of Democrats, to the right of Republicans, between the Democrats and Republicans, or none at all. 3 in 10 rejected third-party and independent candidacies. 1 in 10 preferred candidates to the right of Republicans, and an equal number wanted candidates to the left of Democrats. But the largest segment, 42%, said they would support a candidate between the two major parties. In one respect, this isn't surprising. An annual Gallup survey has long shown a solid majority of Americans open to third-party and independent efforts. What is surprising is that so many of these voters opted for a new party of the center. Previous studies suggested that support for such a party was much smaller than what this new Brookings survey found. On the one hand, these voters rejected many of the positions of the Republican base. They don't believe that the 2020 election was stolen, that whites, Christians, and men are singled out for discrimination, or that immigrants pose a threat to American culture and way of life. On the other hand, they part ways with key tenets of the contemporary Democratic Party. Even though they endorse abortion rights and same-sex marriage, they do not believe, as more than 7 in 10 Democrats do, that generations of slavery and discrimination have made it difficult for Black Americans to work their way out of poverty. They do believe that there are only 2 genders, a proposition rejected by 62% of Democrats. So for the coming midterm elections, these centrist Americans place issues that Republicans emphasize, especially immigration, farther down on their list of concerns. Nor do they share Democrats' focus on matters such as climate change and the gap between rich and poor. Their top issues are inflation and the health of American democracy, which both parties care about, crime, which preoccupies Republicans, and abortion, which the Supreme Court decision pushed to the center of Democrats' concerns. These voters place themselves on the political spectrum just about where one might expect them to. 58% of self-identified moderates say they would support candidates between the Democrats and the Republicans, as do 57% of independents.
When you take a poll, that's what you end up with. You skew the 2 little groups, right? The very conservative, the very liberal. Then you're left with, well, I don't want any change versus I'm willing for a central party. There is something there for someone or someone's to take advantage of and to speak to. And that's what I'm interested in seeing, who those persons will be. You know, who's going to speak to that 40%, that 42% that says, you know, the Democrat, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party doesn't speak to me, nor does the ultra-conservative Tea Party wing of the Republicans speak to me. I want somebody who's going to go in there and solve the healthcare issue, get medical prices down, who will address immigration and crime, who's going to leave my personal rights alone, and who's just going to try to pass laws to help the country get better and to take care of some of the major problems. I know that it's not going to be perfect, but I'm willing to take any improvement that's necessary. Who are those people? I don't know who they are. I know there are talks. We've talked on this show about different groups out there, political groups that are talking about it. We are seeing more and more in everyday media of Republicans and Democrats coming together in Congress to try to sponsor some bills. So it's starting to happen. It's starting, but it's not a steamroller. I mean, it's not coming fast. And I think that's what a misnomer. Well, if we support the middle, then we're not supporting all Americans. And that's where I think that's wrong, because if we get something in the middle to where we pass some legislation that helps the country move forward, it helps all people. Right now, the far reaches of both parties are stymieing anything from being done. And so nothing's happening to fix the said problems that we're all talking about.
And I think the part that comes in theory, right, is part of what you discussed, which is the notion of compromise. When you ask Americans in a hypothetical, right, would you support somebody between Democrats and Republicans, you find that 42% would, 4 in 10 would. And that's, by the way, the largest segment of, what would you support when asking this question.
Right, they had 4 groups, and that was the biggest of the 4 groups. This was the one
that, if these choices are presented to me, somebody further to the left, somebody further to the right, somebody between where Democrats and Republicans currently are, or none, 42%, the plurality would choose somebody between the two.
And you would think the none are the ones who support the Democrats or Republicans.
Correct. Yeah. I mean,
as already,
I don't want anything further to the left, but I want what I already got. Or I don't want anything further to the right, but I want what I already got. Or I don't want to vote at all because I hate all these choices.
Right.
So that would be that group. But the point that I'm getting at, I guess, is we've talked a lot about compromise because compromise is often uncomfortable. And the reason that I think this is interesting is it begs the question, we want it in theory, but could Americans actually rally behind somebody because they would have to sacrifice on some of those points that they do care about, because they wouldn't be finding somebody that's as strong maybe on 80% of what they care about as they do with the two-party system. I'm not saying that can't happen. I'm just saying I think that's the hurdle that you cross. It's not whether or not Americans think they want this. It's in practice. Can it be embodied in a person that people are willing to accept compromise on in the name of not having something so extreme? 40% of Democrats, including 53% of those calling themselves not strong Democrats, would support such centrist candidates, compared with 34% of Republicans. In 2020, 40% of this potential third force voted for Joe Biden, only 27% for Donald Trump. These voters aren't pleased by the prospect of a 2024 presidential election that is a rematch of 2020. Indeed, only 29% want Mr. Trump to be the Republican nominee, and even fewer, 23%, want Mr. Biden to be renominated. If a rematch happens, it is likely that centrists would be even more open to a third-party candidate. It is easy to be skeptical of these findings. After all, large shares of Americans perennially say that they want new electoral choices, but such candidacies have often fallen short. Indeed, no third force has ever gotten close to the 42% who say they want a centrist candidate in 2024, unless you count the Republicans, who succeeded only by displacing one of the two major parties during the 1850s and edging Abraham Lincoln into the presidency with less than 40% of the vote in 1860. Lance, that Abraham Lincoln was elected with less than 50% of the vote of people? Well, how can that happen? How is that possible?
Well,
you mean we have a system that allows that? Is that
in the election of 1860? There were 4 candidates for president.
Oh,
and it
4?
was.
Well, we can't do that. We can only have 2. We can have a third one that's a token person that everybody knows won't get elected, but we can't have 4.
No, there were 4.
Oh, okay.
The Democratic Party split.
Oh,
we are on the brink of civil war, and the Democrats split into Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. And then you have this new political party, new because it was, had not really gained any national prominence, known as the Republicans. And then there was a fourth one known as the Constitutional Union Party that said, yeah, we don't know anything about slavery or a possible war. We just love the United States. So what happened is you had some real sectional rivalries, and the majority of the population lived in the North. So therefore, they had the majority of votes in the Electoral College, and the Republicans swept the northern states, which then gave Lincoln, who only received less than a majority of votes in the popular vote, received the majority in the Electoral College and became president, of which then southern states began to secede before he was even sworn into office.
So we can actually have a president who, when no candidate receives above 50% a majority of the vote, we actually have a process in place to address that situation, right?
You get 270 Electoral College votes. That's all that matters. Doesn't matter how many political parties are running, how many candidates there are.
And if nobody meets that threshold, then the House of Representatives gets the privilege to decide.
Which hasn't been invoked since 1824.
But theoretically.
But it is there. But it is there.
Right. And it's not just another fun tidbit, right, for people to remember is it's not just the House voting with the number of members it has. It's each state gets one vote.
Exactly.
And so all the representatives from the state vote, and then the majority of them decide how their state's going to vote, and then every state gets one vote, and then that's how the presidency.
And they are not tied to their state's popular vote
right.
in any way.
They do whatever they want at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
Talk about political dealing going on.
Yeah. Yep. Boy, that'd be interesting, wouldn't it? So a third party in theory, and we've brought up Lincoln. So what does Lincoln tell us about this, right? Because, I mean, in fairness, part of what the article points out is the only time, arguably, that this has ever happened in our history where this 42% that allegedly wants, to bring a new party into life, brings a new party into life, and in the same time basically succeeds at clinching the presidency. The only time that happened was with Abraham Lincoln. So what does Lincoln have to tell us about what he thinks democracy is? Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. I think people forget, Lance, that, back in the day of Lincoln, they didn't exactly just pick up the telephone or send a text message and say, oh, hey, by the way, the battle at Gettysburg is over and we won. Mm-hmm. It kind of dribbled in, right? Well, we think we won, but we're not really sure. Well, maybe we didn't, but I think we did.
Well, you did have the telegraph.
You did have the telegraph.
So it did go faster than horseback.
Right. So we didn't have to, this wasn't a Paul Revere kind of moment either. But in terms of getting all the information together, it wasn't until July 4th, 1863, that Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army had been forced to retreat and that the news actually reached President Lincoln to let him know. Obviously, that's what led to the famous Gettysburg Address by Lincoln, although he was not the person originally slated to speak, was he, Lance? Well, I mean, he was not the person slated as the keynote address. He was supposed to speak, but it was merely a small piece of what was the 13,000 words that were spoken. He consumed 272.
Right. He spoke for approximately 2 minutes, and Edward Everett spoke for over 2 hours. And the popular press of the day bashed Abraham Lincoln because they said here was a momentous occasion and he didn't say anything worthwhile. And for most of the time, people didn't even hear what he said who were there, because by the time the crowd got quiet, he was done. And so Lincoln, during his time, was bashed by the press and the politicians for how little he said during this momentous occasion. But as we all know, nobody studies the 13,000 words that Mr. Everett said, but most students, at least in the old days, would tear apart the Gettysburg Address from Abraham Lincoln and parlay it into all kinds of good things that he had to say. But again, most of it was done posthumously. It wasn't really addressed and looked at until Lincoln had passed away.
So there's a lot of different phrases that people study and pay attention to in the Gettysburg Address, like 77 years ago, talking about the past, the present. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can endure, and the future. We here highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain. Phrases that many people who studied it are familiar with. But what about the least well-examined words of the address? Are its expansive triplet, that is, government of the people, by the people, for the people. And you might say, well, I've heard that many times before, but it's not necessarily broken down and examined very closely in terms of the Gettysburg Address. 272 words doesn't leave a lot of room for detailed explanations. So lots of strong statements, but what does that actually mean, this triplet? Well, the first, that is government of the people. According to our ancient faith, Lincoln said in his 1854 speech objecting to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which compromised on slavery, quote, the just powers of governments are derived from the consent of the governed. That meant plainly that, quote, no man is good enough to govern another man without the other's consent. I say this is the leading principle, the sheet anchor of American republicanism.
And that's what, his point is very well taken, that the only way the government works is if we, the people, accept it as a true entity. And that's all he's saying, is that, the people have the power and the people give the government the power to govern.
Generally speaking, in many other forms of government, even some quote unquote modern democracies, right, still are based on a principle of the divine providing the authority to an individual to lead a group of people. So it's a top-down, not bottom-up sort of approach that a lot of governments, including the one that we separated from, were based on. And this is a totally different, fundamentally different idea of the power comes from collectively the people essentially giving up part of their power willfully to allow their government to make decisions for them.
Well, working with our young people for the last 35 years, they're amazed when I look at them and say, well, the government only has the power that we give them. And they're like, no, they don't. The government gets to do whatever they want. And I'm like, no, that's not the way our country's rules were established, nor is it what they say. If the government's doing something that we, the people, don't like, we have the power to change it. If, and here's where everybody falls short, if we can get 51% of the people to agree with us.
A second distinctive feature of democracy is the people's voice in the affairs of governing. Government by the people. It matters very little whether that active voice is the direct participation of individuals, as in ancient Athens, or through their representatives, as in the American Constitution. From his earliest moments in politics, Lincoln argued that government by the people, through their laws and through elections, had not by mobs with nooses and shotguns, that was the only legitimate expression of democracy. He said, quote, "I do not deny the possibility that the people may err in an election. But if they do, the true cure is in the next election."
Which, again, it speaks to so many things that have happened in our country in the last 2 to 3 years. He's not saying that maybe mistakes can be made by the populace, but that those mistakes should not be corrected by mobs of people taking up arms or pitchforks or whatever against the government. You make amends for any mistakes you've made in the next election, be it the House, the Senate, the president. That's where, mayor, city council, whatever. You don't take up arms. Your power, your weapon is your vote. That's the weapon that we have in our democracy, is our vote, and we need to use our vote.
The last one I think is essential because it speaks to, okay, so far we've talked about two very important components, right? Government of the people, the consent comes from the people, by the people, right? They choose who's going to represent them. So this talks a lot about the foundation of how we form, right? Where does the power come from? Who are we giving the power to make decisions for us? But what about what should be done with that power, right? And that's where the last part of that triplet comes into play. And that's government for the people. The third basic element of democracy is that government serves the interest of the people, not those of a monarch, an aristocracy, or an angry and contemptuous elite. For that reason, Lincoln wrote that government served to do only those things that need, quote, to be done, but which cannot, by individual effort, do at all or do so well for themselves, end quote. This includes things like roads and bridges, schools and asylums, the enforcement of laws, and the defense of the nation. While government isn't, quote, charged with the duty of redressing or preventing all the wrongs in the world, he said in 1859, it does have the responsibility to keep, quote, planting and cultivating too many thorns in the bosom of society.
And see, to me, I take it, and exactly what Lincoln says, but I take it as the government works for the people of the United States to solve the problems so that clears the way for them to have a better life.
And specifically solve the problems that they themselves alone would have trouble solving. Like right. You think about a road, right? And we all take that for granted because we're just all used to our entire lives. Pretty much the government manages the roads, right? I mean, we don't actively go out and pave the roads ourselves typically. But imagine a time before that took place. And there was
such a time.
And how inconvenient that would be who takes care of the road? Well, nobody, or whoever feels like it, or the stretch that's out in front of you. And what if you take care of it very differently than somebody else takes care of it? Or what if somebody doesn't take care of it at all? Or what if there is no road in this area? All those many things which it wouldn't be very practical to say that Lance needs to be responsible for the road that he uses, because a lot of other people need to use that road too. So how are they going to make decisions? Who's going to fund it? Who's going to care for it? Who's going to make sure it goes in a path that makes sense? All these many things that seem, again, we take for granted. Well, because of course the government would manage the road. We're not going to have Lance manage the road. But the point, I think, is well taken in that this is something that it would be very inefficient and not very effective, and would not serve anybody very well for each individual person to have to try to handle on their own.
And see, I take it one step further. I think that's a great explanation. But that's the role of the government, and we're not seeing it being done. You have Democrats arguing for this. You have Republicans arguing for this. Democrats saying they're representing their constituents, Republicans saying they're representing, and what's getting done? Nothing. So we are, to your point, to your example, all out there trying to fix the road ourselves because we are getting no government help because they're too busy representing us to solve the problems. And I think that's why, to tie it to our first segment, so many of us, 40-some%, are looking for an alternative to the two parties because we're tired of listening to the two parties argue about what they want to do and doing nothing. And we're willing to take someone in the middle who will fix that road for us so that we can get on with our lives. Because right now, many Americans, I believe, feel they are out there struggling to fix the entire road themselves because the government's doing nothing.
The government's supposed to be taking care of the road, but instead, Lance has grabbed his shovel and his bucket and is going out to fill the pothole because for some reason we can't seem to get our government to do the thing that it's supposed to do and keep the road in good shape. So does that mean that it's time for that centrist party? Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. Lincoln said that government served to do only the things that, quote, need to be done, but which they cannot, by individual effort, do at all or do so well for themselves. Like we talked about roads at the end of the last segment, bridges, schools, asylums, things that individually aren't always very practical to bring effectively into use to benefit all people. And I think this is such an important notion of what we think our government is supposed to be. And maybe that's something that we haven't, I think, honestly, Lance, a huge part of the contention right now is there's a big disagreement about, I don't know if anybody in government's on the same page about what government is supposed to be. I think there's a lot of different ideas, and they've forgotten in the prospect of exploring all the new things that government could be or could do or should do or might do, that fundamentally we're falling short of doing the thing that government must do, a democracy for our people, which is do the things that we ourselves can't do well, right? And those aren't always the exciting things. When we talked about infrastructure, finally we got an infrastructure bill, right? But think about how long we talked about that. I mean, why did that take so long? There's no reason it should have. Is that particularly exciting? No. Is it really important to successful, prosperous individual lives, to our economy, and to our future prosperity? Yes, but it's not super exciting.
Well, I think you've summed it up on multiple shows when you say that the current politician is working to get reelected, not working to solve the problems of the country. So that's why I think a third party can work. I mean, I think it's time to countermand our government, and that is to recall or order back by a superseding contrary order. And very simply, what does that mean? It means that we've entrusted them to do something and they're not doing it. So now to countermand, meaning it is our authority to take that away from them and give it to somebody else. And yes, that's our word of the day, but that's what I'm talking about. And back to Lincoln's premise, we don't do it with guns and knives and pitchforks. We do it with our power to vote. We do it by getting out there and voting in elected officials who are going to do the job that we believe the government should do, and that is solve those problems that we can't solve ourselves because they're too big, and then allowing us then to go down those roads to do the things that we need to take care of ourselves and our families and our neighbors. And we don't have that right now. To what you've always, in my opinion, we don't have that. We have elected officials who are busy scaring us to vote for them or telling us what the other side's going to do to us. And so therefore we need to vote for them to stay in power. And they're spending their time scaring us or telling us what we should be afraid of rather than passing laws to help us lead our lives much easier and much more fulfilling, which is why the government exists. So per Lincoln, I think it's time to vote. Even if a centrist party doesn't win, maybe it gets the attention of the Democrats and Republicans to do what they were elected to do, and that is pass laws that improve the lives of the majority of the people in this country.
Lincoln said in 1861, "I do not deny the possibility that the people may err in an election, but if they do, the true cure is in the next election." Now, maybe we've been erring in elections for some time, but the point is that there is always the next election, right? If today's not good, there is tomorrow. And we do have elections on the horizon, and we do have the opportunity to decide. We heard how unexcited in the first segment Americans are about a Donald Trump and Joe Biden rematch. I mean, people don't want that, Very few people want that. Most people, right, would like would like to see a new direction because people are frustrated. And I think that then leads us to the question of, again, it's nice in theory. In practice, what does it take? It takes a willingness, in this case, I think, for the American people to be comfortable with compromise. Because the reality is, folks, you're compromising right now, and you're compromising more than you have to. You might say, well, what are you talking about? Because we've decided that we don't want to compromise, what we've actually done is created two more severe extremes, right, where neither of them ever get everything they tell us they're going to get done. So it's just the illusion that you're not compromising. What happens is you're actually ceding more ground than you would if we all accepted up front a little compromise and actually got stuff done. At least I think that's part of what's happening. Lincoln, in theory, had a nice idea about not taking up arms against each other and not by angry mobs, but let's remember he was also the president presiding over the Civil War. So maybe that was some wishful thinking on his part, because we know as a country, things can get pretty nasty. We will literally kill hundreds of thousands of our own people because we disagree.
Because we won't compromise.
And I think Lincoln's point was that should never happen again. There is no reason for us to ever get to that point. It is unnecessary. We have a system. If we don't allow the system to control us, but if we choose to control the system, which is supposed to be the foundation of the system, then we don't have to get to that point.
I think you speak wisdom in your youth. But again.
So now we just have to do all that, Lance. It should be no problem.
I think people, are reaching a breaking point, and as we've seen, and we have to turn it over to ourselves and say, we're tired of this and we're going to elect people who are more centrist. You're not, the problem, but and this is for another show, but the problem is our political party system. Because we've seen the Democrats are out there, they're going to change the way they choose their nominee. They're going to go to South Carolina first instead of Iowa. They're not going to follow the same pattern they always have because they want different parts of the country to be represented in that process. And most Americans are like, well, wait a minute. Don't both sides have to do the same thing? Therein lies the problem of political parties in general. That's why this centrist party is so appealing. Would it work? I don't know. It's hard to say that with 42% of the people that's enough to make that change. When you have 10%, 30% who don't want any change whatsoever, they're comfortable with the system as it is. So we're not there yet, but there are thoughts out there. We know we've been hinting and we've been reading where there are a group of Democrats and a group of Republicans who are tossing around the point of running a one candidate from one party for the president and the other candidate being the opposite party. I think that's an intriguing thought, and to see where it would go and how it would play out above the political rancor of the Democratic nominee process and the Republican nominee process. What if we just had a group of people who got together and said, you know what, these are our nominees and we're running for election, while the other two beat each other up trying to pick their nominee.
Do their theatrics.
Right. Let them do their thing. But wait a minute, who's getting the front page every day? Oh, this group that's already chosen their party, and this is what they're going to run on, and this is what they're going to do, and this is how they're going to bring the country back together. Sounds like a recipe for success to me, but who am I? Nobody's asked me, nobody's polled me. So, but I like the concept. I like the idea, and I think it could work.
So why do we have this conversation today, Lance?
Well, because here at True Chat, we have a mission, and our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And I believe we've done that, and please give us your feedback if you don't think we have, or if you think we have, tell us what we're doing that's working. Share this with your family and friends, and if they say, hey, I think I'd like to listen to that on my own so I don't have to get it secondhand from you, tell them, well, they can find us as a podcast on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
New episodes of The State of Us can be heard Tuesdays and Thursdays, first thing in the morning as a podcast. The same episodes heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the United States and parts of Canada. For The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch. And of course, thank you, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.